Good morning. So today with me, we have our session on China and the internet, looking in and looking out. And to my right is Samm, who's a senior fellow on the Technology Policy Program at the Center for Strategic International Studies. Samm, can you say a little bit about that program and that function?
Sure, and thank you very much to Cloudflare for having me. I'm really excited to be here. So CSIS is a think tank based in Washington. We look at global technology policy, right on all sorts of things. I focus on China.
Just that small part of the world, China.
Right.
So can you let's set the stage a little bit. So we're talking about China being sort of an insider's view and those that are looking in. Just set the stage. How would you describe the current state of China vis-a-vis the internet?
I think there are a lot of misconceptions about the internet in the West when we look at China. Everyone focuses on the Great Firewall and censorship, and this is a big deal in China. You know, when I'm over there, I can't just go visit the New York Times and CNN. But it's not the whole picture. And we sort of have to keep two things in mind. This is a country that's very concerned about you have more users going out, getting information that would be censored in China, but you also have the internet transforming people's lives. The digital economy is really changing, and I think it's futuristic. When I'm over there in China, I'm able to do things with my mobile phone that I don't do when I'm at home.
I was there a couple weeks ago, and I think you'd been there recently. You talked about did you lose a credit card, and what happened?
So the last time I was in China, I showed up and lost my ATM card, but it didn't matter. I did everything on my phone. They're a cashless society, essentially, right now. So within one app, I was able to do e-payments. They also have like money market. You can pay your utilities. You can get train tickets. Sort of bundled in one app are the things that maybe you would do on 20 different apps on your phone here in the US.
Yeah, I felt a little bit out of place pulling Chinese yuan out of my pocket. They looked at me like you clearly have no idea.
Who is this old guy?
Yes, pulling.
Yeah.
It wasn't just the beard. So talk about how that's changed over time. So the current state is quite connected, and there's a lot of fintech that's been applied. Has that been the case for the last 5 years? Is that the last 2 years? How has it changed?
The speed and the scale of change with China's internet is just incredible. It's mind-boggling. 5 years ago, I don't think it would have looked like this, right? But the last time I was over there, I was out at Alibaba headquarters in Hangzhou, and just hearing about how digital technology is changing things. So if you think about their equivalent, their top shopping day in China, Alibaba processes something like 250,000 transactions per second. Visa on Cyber Monday is 24,000 transactions a second.
Yeah, order of magnitude.
Order of magnitude, yeah.
So let's just let's do something fun here. So order of magnitude, size and scale of China. In Beijing, there's an outer road. Just as it's sort of mind-blowing to put it in perspective. Does anybody know how wide or how many miles around the outer road it is? Do you know this?
I don't.
Anybody know? It's 1,000 kilometers in their outer road around Beijing. So at 70 or 100 kilometers an hour, it would take you a day. But have you been to, what's the speed on the outer roads? 20, 30? Yeah. It's not very long. So it's like a 5 or 6 day trip around. Yeah. What are the other things in China that are sort of mind-boggling from a scale perspective, especially as it relates to the internet and how it's changing over time?
Well, I think we also have to keep in mind that internet penetration rates in China now are only something like 50%. So as much as we're blown away by how digital technology is transforming people's lives, there's still a long way to go, and there's a huge growth potential there. I don't know off the top of my head what it is in the US, but I think it's something, it's probably closer to 80% or something, right? So you've got a significant number of people in the countryside, for instance, that aren't yet connected. And I think there's a lot of growth.
Yeah, it's big and getting bigger. Let's talk a little bit. So we talked about the context for it's large, it's quite developed. Let's go deep into why does the firewall exist? What's the purpose?
Yeah. So when I think about China, I'm often holding two contradictory ideas in my mind at one time that would seem paradoxical, but they both are there and we have to recognize them. So you have the most advanced censorship apparatus in the world. Millions of people, whether you're talking about state money, the number of bodies that are hired by the government to go on and track what people are doing online. But then you also have this thriving digital economy and entrepreneurship around that, right? And I think we have to sort of think about both of these things as true at once. What's behind it is the government recognized that their ability to control and monitor these new technologies was falling behind. And so they've also put in place, I think it's one of the most comprehensive regulatory legal systems in the world on cyberspace. The cybersecurity law, further ahead than any other place in the world in terms of how do you regulate digital content, what they call critical information infrastructure, and a lot of rules around that. Controls on what kind of data can flow in and out of the country. So these are two tracks that we have to keep in mind.
So as we think about the firewall and as an outsider looking in, you often have this Mao jacket oppressed society reel that plays over as like propaganda, at least it did historically. What's it like inside of China? Are people unhappy? Are they okay with the regulated content? What's the insider's view?
Yeah, and again, let's go back to this sort of two-track. We have to keep contradictory things in our mind at once when we think about this in China. What the media here in the West has covered is you hear stories about surveillance state in Xinjiang, and that's very real and very concerning. You also have, I think when I go over there and I'm with my friends, I'll go and I'll say, hey, what's your favorite app on your phone? And they'll say, oh, well, there's this great new one, which is like a combination of Uber, Overstock, Yelp, and Groupon, and like all these things all in one. And so my friend's like, oh yeah, there's this new app. I wanted to make an order across town for a special new kind of ice cream. I found a guy on my phone to go and stand in line for me so I could get the ice cream. The ice cream was sold out, so we went and got it on the equivalent of Overstock. He went and picked it up and brought it back to me. And this all happened within about 45 minutes through one app on his phone. And going back to like the scale and traffic in China, you can't get anywhere in like under an hour and a half.
Right.
So the fact that he was able to do this whole transaction and have the guy go and get it and come back, I mean, that's how...
Doesn't sound oppressed.
No, I think it's really, there's a sense that this is really changing for the better people's lives.
And is there a trade that, so is a firewall the right way to express one's view around what should and shouldn't be consumed? Are any other areas in the world adopting the same point of view?
So I'm going to put in a little plug here. I have an article coming out in The Atlantic in the next couple days talking about how China's cyber policy model is spreading around the world. And I think for the first time, we've taken for granted this market-based, democratic, open internet model. We've sort of taken for granted that that's the norm. I think for the first time, we have a real alternative competitive model for the internet. So China, in countries that they're investing, these countries are also beginning to take lessons from Beijing's playbook about how do you govern the internet. Countries like Tanzania, for example, the cyber officials in China have been working very closely with the Tanzanian government about, well, here's how we dealt with a lot of challenges online, from censorship tools to data localization to indigenous standards. Vietnam just codified their first cybersecurity law, which looks a lot like China's. So there's an innate appeal to many countries to the China cyber policy model. The internet can be used as a weapon against its own country's own citizens. Think about, hate speech, the use of social media to sort of galvanize genocide in places like Myanmar. So for countries like this, I think there is an appeal to the way that Beijing is going about it, and we're beginning to see a proliferation of that model.
I have 4 children. 2 of them are in college now, and the ones that are in high school and younger. I often wonder if I've done something totally wrong as a parent, because the content that they've been exposed to growing up in the Bay Area, it's quite varied, versus somebody that maybe grew up in an area that had a little bit more content restriction. So I don't think I do a great job with my own firewall in my home, and I think that the Chinese version maybe is maybe a better version than what I've done as a parent. So it is being exported to other parts of the world, especially in areas that China has influence.
Yeah.
And do you think is there another version of that? So is that the way to sort of extend policies and policing on the internet? Might we see it in other developing parts of the world in addition to where China has an outsized influence?
Yeah, I think so. And I think in some cases there's I don't want to overstate this. I don't think that there's like a master plan by the Chinese government to go and sort of confront the Western-led internet model, right? I think sometimes countries are doing it on their own and sort of saying, oh, these tools have an innate appeal. Sometimes, like in the Tanzania case, there is more of a sort of direct engagement and influence to try to spread that model.
Makes sense. So let's switch gears for a moment. Let's talk about the rise of the bigs in China. There was a slide that Mary Meeker put out recently, and she talked about by market cap technologies numbers, the largest companies 1 through 5. It's the familiar. It's the Google, Amazon, Facebook, Microsoft, and Amazon. 1 through 5, but not in that order necessarily. And then 6 and 7 were Alibaba and Tencent. And so as you project into the future, especially given the demographics in the country and coming online, is it just illogical that they will rise to the top? Should we expect to see Alibaba, Tencent, or the next one sitting on the top of that leaderboard soon?
What I'm looking for are companies like Alibaba and Tencent going to be successful outside of China. You know, I've had conversations with folks at both those companies, and anecdotally, what I've heard is you're inside a relatively closed ecosystem in China. Think about that sort of cyber policy model that we talked about before. How does that translate to global markets? And we know that companies like Alibaba are looking at Europe, they're looking at Asia. It's going to be hard nut to crack. At the same time, you have the Chinese government has come out. Xi Jinping gave a speech in April talking about his vision for cyberspace. And again, he reiterated this point about the need to have big and strong Chinese internet companies. And actually a previous speech, he mentioned specifically Alibaba, Tencent, Huawei. This is part of the sort of global aspiration. I think that there's a dance that goes on with these companies and the Chinese government. Sometimes there's a perception that they're one and the same. Jack Ma has this great quote where he said, describing his relationship with Beijing, he said, just because you love somebody doesn't mean you should marry them, right? So these are companies that their success is only possible if they have the support of the Chinese government. But these are private companies. They were funded by private investor money. And I think their ability to be successful globally is only possible if they can keep the government just out of their way. So when we think about things like the cybersecurity law, very strict regulatory tools on companies, Alibaba is going to be the one on the front lines, for example, when you're controlling the ability to send data across borders. Alibaba is trying to expand aggressively in Europe and in Asia. How are they going to do that if they can't send data, or outside of China, right? So there's a dance we have to keep in mind. That said, if anyone ever tells you, a China expert, a consultant, well, let me tell you about the relationship between Jack Ma and Xi Jinping, just ignore them. They have no idea. I don't know anything. We don't know anything. This is all speculation. We don't really know.
So that's the first tip of the day, is if somebody says they know the relationships, you should ignore them.
Yeah. That's
very practical.
Right. One more point about practicality. Yes. So when I was at Alibaba last time, outside, if you go to their headquarters, they have several very large statues of people walking with their heads down outside on their campus. So I asked, what's the story with these statues? And they said, well, we like the idea that people have their heads down is meant to symbolize and remind us not to have our heads in the clouds. We're here to use technology to solve practical problems. This is about what are real problems and challenges in society that technology can be used to address. And so again, going back to this point of what are the sort of misperceptions and ways from the outside when we look at China, I think there's this sense that the Chinese government is only using technology to feed into a vast surveillance state, which again, does exist. Keep two paradoxical things in your mind at once. But technology is also being used to address real problems and make people's lives better. And so I see those statues at Alibaba as a very sort of concrete illustration of that.
So let's take this a little bit further. There's one view that China is new to the scene. But in reality, if you rewind the tape, they would suggest that this is a reemergence. It's a renaissance. We've been here before. We've been very influential. This vision of Mao suits and hose coming out of the villages is a little bit overplayed. So talk to me about how their view of themselves sort of retaking their rightful place and seat at the table, how does that manifest? And is that accurate? Might you characterize it differently?
Well, I always look at Xi Jinping's speeches and to sort of get a sense of what are the aspirations of the government in this area. And in October, they had a convening called the 19th Party Congress, which is a twice-in-a-decade meeting of China's top leaders. And Xi Jinping gave an opening speech, and he explicitly called for China to be what he referred to as a cyber superpower. You can sort of quibble with people about how to translate that term, and I've done this with other linguists. But I think that being a cyber superpower is an accurate depiction of what they're looking to achieve. This is an economy that's shifted from a sort of low-end, heavy manufacturing, export-led growth model, and now sees the internet and digital technology as a way to sort of rejuvenate the economy and kind of restore China's rightful place as a leader. They've, in addition to being a cyber superpower, they've also talked about having this sort of right to speak in international forums and shape the way, not just be leaders in terms of the technology, but sort of the governance and policy structures around those new technologies.
Yeah, there's David Gossett was describing this as, we have historically had some version of it's at a America superpower, European superpowers. When in reality, there's a multitude of powers, and we have to learn to live in a world that can handle that amount of influence, and they're not always aligned.
They don't, and I think one of the greatest challenges for multinational companies now is you have different models for things like cross-border data flows, and how do you operate internationally in this environment where whether you're talking about cross-border data flows, whether you're talking about data privacy, it's becoming increasingly difficult to have international interoperability as these different sort of approaches to governing technology move forward.
So let's talk a little bit about GDPR and how China views data. There was a statistic that Mary Meeker came out with that said that China, the concern around, so China populace giving up access to their data, there was more concern by their population than there was as an example, in Europe or in North America, which was surprising to me as I was going through and sort of sifting through facts. How do you think about, how does China view the rest of the world, especially in light of GDPR and data?
Well, first of all, there's a misconception that data privacy sort of awareness doesn't exist in China. And it does. I mean, we've seen, even in the past year, a number of outcries on Chinese social media where people are really concerned that their data, their personal data, is being misappropriated by Chinese private companies, sold on the black market. There have been a number of scandals. And so at the end of last year, China quietly issued their first data protection standard, which spells out very granular rules around what does consent mean, the conditions upon which companies can collect, process, store, share, transfer your personal data. And I've been in conversations with the lead drafter of this standard to try to understand what were the intentions behind it. Believe it or not, he actually, when he was writing it, modeled it after GDPR. And there was an effort made to sort of strengthen Chinese users' control over their information. Now, I do think, again, going back to this sort of two-track idea, that so people will be like, wait a second, GDPR is the strictest privacy legislation in the world. How on earth is China modeling its own regulations after that? Is that even possible, right? And I think the answer is we have to think of data privacy as having two tracks in China. One is about what companies are able to do, and the other is about what the government can do. So you have very strict rules now coming online to regulate, restrict companies' handling of data. I think the government kind of has their own separate system where there are actual tools now for the government to collect more real name identity information about internet users.
So how should we think about the penalties of doing it wrong inside of China? So if you're a company that wants to do business inside of the Great Walls of China, we try to do it right, but when it goes wrong, what does that look like as a foreign company?
Yeah, I think that these new data protection rules unfortunately can be used for more of a political purpose in an ad hoc way. And I think that goes for multinationals and Chinese companies. There's actually a tension right now where Chinese internet companies have gotten a lot of power inside China because they have massive amounts of data. And I think these new regulatory tools in some ways are a way for the Chinese government to kind of put a check on them and say, hey, here's another way that we can control you.
The notion of getting it wrong in China, I think, sends fear through a lot of companies because the stakes are quite high. If you look at companies that have done it wrong and run afoul of current regulations or regulations that change over time, it can mean the end of a very long investment you've made coming to bear. Yeah. And I think that the fear is that you get it really wrong. And
Chinese companies are also really freaked out about GDPR. Like a day before GDPR took effect, I was hearing that Chinese companies were scrambling to think, well, how can we comply? I heard, one company was saying, wait, do we need to now go get consent from all of our users on our privacy policies? Because these are companies that are also expanding into Europe and are going to have to, how are they going to be compliant? I don't know if that's even possible.
It's nice to know that they're as concerned about it as others are.
They are, yeah.
And perhaps getting the 500 emails in their inbox that going for consent.
Yes.
So let's just do a little bit of sort of open topic around what are the things that, as an outsider looking in, you probably assume this to be true, but in reality it's false. Let's start there. What do people get wrong, and they think it's true, but it's actually not true?
Well, one basic thing is that I've mentioned before blocked sites in China, like New York Times, you can't get on in China. You have to have a VPN. Although now the Chinese government has really been cracking down on VPN use, and so that's getting more difficult than it used to be. And this is sort of a gray area where I think before the government sort of turned away and was like, okay, we want people to be able to access this stuff, but we just want to have more control over how they do it. So there was a great study done at Harvard a couple years ago where they actually went on and they looked at what was censored and what wasn't, and they found that the government actually allows a lot of criticism of the government online, but where they did censor is where there was a potential for mass movement. So like an Arab Spring type of situation, would be censored.
And is that considered for the internal, for the population of China, the citizens, is that considered acceptable? Is there any grousing or discomfort around I don't get free access to the New York Times?
I mean, again, I think we have to remember that China's not monolithic, and there's some pretty scary stuff happening in certain parts of China around, cracking down on we could talk about the Xinjiang situation. I don't want to get too much into that, but there's some pretty scary stuff happening around that. There are also parts of China where I think people are really, don't need to read. Why do they need to read the New York Times? I disagree with a ton of stuff the New York Times says, and so I don't think that that's really top of mind for a lot of people.
Can you unpack a little bit? We talk about that. You reference it being monolithic. China is not just one large entity.
Yeah.
How might you describe it for folks that have not spent as much time thinking about it as you have? What are some lenses that you would apply that would give more stratification or break it onto a spectrum?
Well, first, let's go back to this point about China's internet penetration rate is really only 50%. I think that there are parts of China that have been untouched so far by the digital economy. There are also internal fault lines, and tensions within the system itself. I think that there is a debate about this relationship between economic growth and security. And how do you both have Chinese global internet companies that are competing in international markets, but you also have this very robust sort of security apparatus around that? I think there's also a debate about privacy and AI in a similar way that is happening here. So when China's data privacy standard came out, one of the big complaints from Chinese companies was, this is going to restrict our ability to be leaders in AI, which is a mandate that the Chinese government has given us. And so these are fault lines and internal debates we have to keep in mind.
And pull on the AI thing for a second. Do you think that China is going to outpace the rest of the world with their investment in machine learning?
Yeah. So again, we have to distinguish between aspirations and reality. And the revision, China has an AI development plan that I think talks about sort of being a global leader, surpassing the US by 2030 or something like this. But let's bring it down to the ground. What does this actually look like? I was talking with one of the top VC firms in China and their lead for AI, and she said, you'd be surprised, but like one of my favorite companies right now doing AI, they're using AI for mushroom picking. Mushroom picking is something that can use computer vision, machine learning. Millennial workers in China, they don't want to work on this assembly line picking out different mushrooms anymore. Mushroom picking is a very high margin industry in China, and they need people to do this job. And they're using AI and machine learning in the mushroom picking factories. And I think that's really exciting. So again, it goes back to this question of what are the real world practical challenges that these technologies can be used to solve.
So you heard it here first, mushroom picking and AI.
So remember, it's mushroom picking, and then you also have scary robots, taking over the United States. Maybe it's somewhere in between.
I think we're at the point where we wanted to open it up to some questions. So if there are some microphones that are going to float around. If you have any questions, just put your hand up so we can see who you are. And I don't know if in the back, there's one right here. Can we bring a microphone up here? Actually, we'll come to you in a moment. We'll start over here because there's a mic in somebody's hand already.
I just wanted to ask, what's the difference between Hong Kong and the rest of China? I used to work in Hong Kong, so I'm just interested in your view.
I think, yeah. Well, Hong Kong is part of China, and I think from a government perspective, there's a very close relationship, but there's also a tension there. And I think that the recent election, you saw some of that tension play out. The Chinese government is very interested in keeping a tight grip on China, and so the digital economy extends that. Now, one question I've heard is, will regulations around the digital economy on mainland extend to China? So, for example,
to Hong Kong.
Hong Kong.
Yeah.
So data flow restrictions, certain types of regulatory scrutiny on critical infrastructure providers in China. Does that also extend to Hong Kong? I think that's a regulatory gray zone.
That's a good question. The microphone over here.
We've obviously seen a lot in the news about Russian manipulation of US elections and Brexit and so forth, whether that's true or not. Is China known to be engaged in sort of similar schemes to sort of manipulate international economies and elections and so forth?
It's a very light question.
Yeah. We've talked a lot today about more of the sort of digital economy aspect of the internet in China, but there's also a sort of national security dimension. And Xi Jinping has said, without cybersecurity, there is no national security. There's been a lot of political resources put into a new body within the Chinese government that is in charge of sort of cyberspace, which also includes the kind of offensive cyber capability part of the Chinese government. So I think this is an area where the government is also investing a lot of focus. It is a part of that cyber superpower vision.
I think you dodged that well.
Hello.
Thank you.
Question in the back.
Hello, I'm Mr. Wang. I come from Hong Kong, actually. I wanted to follow up the previous question about Hong Kong. Because I know the national security law, that's as known as the Basic Law, Article 23, will be introduced above the next year. Because the Chinese government wanted tight the Hong Kong freedom after the umbrella revolution. What do you mean about the Basic Law Article 23, the influence of Article 23 in for the Hong Kong internet freedom about this? What do you think?
Article 23?
Yes, Basic Law Article 23. What is the Article 23 in Hong Kong Basic Law? That means the Hong Kong government should enact the law about the national security or something like that. In Hong Kong, introduced to Hong Kong.
So extending the reach of mainland China's policy into Hong Kong, is that the...
Yeah. I mean, I think this is, and I'm not an expert in Hong Kong and Hong Kong politics, so I will probably defer more to you on what that means there. I, again, just look at it in this context of this is a government in Beijing that is increasing political power around its leader and using cyberspace as a tool in that arsenal.
I think we have time for one more question, and then we're going to wrap up. And I can't say, we're over here on the left, sorry, far left.
Hi there. I just wanted to go back to the GDPR model that you say China has, one for companies and one for the people. Do you know what the government is allowed to do with the data that it has on the people?
Well, I'll tell you, the way that it's portrayed in the media is a bit simplistic. I think there's a perception that there's one government entity that all data is feeding into that then is used for things like algorithmic governance to sort of allot different rights in society based on what happens with that data. I'll tell you, it's very fragmented. So within the government, you have different bodies that are housing that data and aren't sharing it with each other. And whoever in the government, I think, has more of that data pool will have enormous political power. So we're sort of seeing a sort of turf war play out right over that right now. But we have already seen the use of data around like court orders, law enforcement actions, things people do on trains. That is beginning to feed into different sort of government allocation of rights. I don't think we're there yet. I think there's a sort of dystopian fear that this is going to take over everything in China, and we're not quite there yet. As I said, there are a lot of implementation challenges around it.
Samm, thank you very much for taking time today, and I appreciate the folks in the audience spending time with us as well.
Thank you.